You are listening to the Tricorder Transmissions, episode 89. And now, here are Craig and Jeff.
What's going on, everybody? It is the Tricorder Transmissions, episode 89. Tonight we'll be talking about Gold Key Comics, issue number 9, The Legacy of Lazarus, issued in February of 1971. We are your hosts, Jeff Hewlett.
And Craig Cohen.
Craig Cohen, you have something that you wanted to mention?
Yeah. As we know, I've been out here in Vegas for coming up on actually 2 months when this episode airs, and I've made some podcasting friends who do a Vegas-based podcast, and I was able to actually sit down and have breakfast with one of them.
Nice.
This guy Chris, who I met through the Faces and Aces Las Vegas podcast. It's facesandaceslv.com if you want to check them out. And their show is really a love letter to the city and the people who work in it. So if you're interested in Las Vegas, definitely give it a listen. It's a fun show. And Chris actually brought with him and gifted to me the full run of Harlan Ellison's The City on the Edge of Forever comic books, signed by artist J.K. Woodward.
Wow. Got
at the LA Comic-Con. He saw them and he thought of me. So big thanks again, Chris. It was excellent meeting you, and really, really dig the podcast.
Very cool. So tonight, as we said earlier, this is episode 89 of the Tricorder Transmissions, and we're going to be talking about Gold Key Comics, issue number 9, The Legacy of Lazarus, and issued in February of 1971, 32 pages, star date 10.26.3, sometime in the 2260s. And, you know, I was very sad to learn, Craig, that this episode does not reference Lazarus from the alternative factor at all.
Oh, yeah. Well, it seems like this issue really sort of utilized characters that we saw on the original series, but they're different versions. So I think this issue, if nothing else, really establishes that they're two set fixed continuities.
Yeah, so I guess we'll get into it a little bit more as we talk about the comic itself. But getting into the cover features a picture of Spock from Amok Time.
Yeah.
Yet again, which has nothing whatsoever to do with this comic. This is a straight-on shot of Spock with this purple knitted sash wrapped around his waist. And there's a picture of Kirk in the upper left-hand corner talking into a communicator, which I'm not sure what episode that comes from.
Yeah, that almost looks like it could be a promo shot, maybe.
Yeah, probably. And there's a tagline that says, this very weird tagline, it says, George Washington is alive and well. Watch out, Spock.
They've got my 15 cents.
Yeah, 15 cents seems to be worth it for this. But, you know, it's weird. I don't know that when the action goes down and George Washington is throwing fists, Spock is nowhere to be seen. He's in a completely different place. So what is Spock supposed to watch out for?
Oh, good point.
Yeah, it's very, very weird. So as we've done in prior episodes, I'll give you, all listeners, a quick countdown. So if you have not read this comic and don't want spoilers, feel free to stop our podcast now. We're going to start talking about The Legacy of Lazarus in 3, 2, 1. All right, so we start off with another captain's log, and this comic does not feature the floating book.
No.
As prior issues have, but the captain's log reads, Captain's log, stardate 1026.3. We've established orbit around Gamma Alpha 5 to verify findings of the robot probe that discovered this planet 10 years ago. So the planet, according to the probe, is Class M, and once again, miraculously, it's uninhabited. The laughter from Craig Cohen should let you know that prior comic discussions, all the planets always seem to be initially uninhabited. So this doesn't seem to coincide with the current sensor readings, and Mr. Spock senses that there is civilization on the planet, so and including some sort of an enormous city on the planet. So Kirk orders Spock, Sulu, Uhura, and McCoy to the transporter room to beam down and check things out. So Scotty in the transporter room beams down the landing party, and they discover themselves in the midst of a giant city. They begin to do some exploration. Kirk spots a humanoid person across the street from where they're standing and discovers that it is, in fact, the forefather of our country, George Washington. But he's kind of shocked to know that George Washington has been dead for over 400 years and seems to be alive and well on this planet. So Spock does some tricorder magic trickery and discovers that this version of George Washington is, in fact, real and is a perfect replica of the original George Washington from our own world in the United States way, way back. And Washington himself approaches the landing party and invites them over for dinner and introduces his wife, who happens to be the former Helen of Troy. He explains that they've lived on this planet for as long as they can remember, and they can do anything they want except visit this mysterious silver spire that exists in the center of their city. So Kirk, of course, can't help himself and tells Spock and Sulu to go off and investigate this mysterious tower. So this seems like a good place to stop and examine what's happened so far. So, Craig, do you have any thoughts so far on this?
Yeah, interesting in the bridge shot. I'm not sure if the layout of the bridge is different, but this is one of the is this one of the first times we're actually seeing the true bridge in the comic book?
Yeah, probably the second time, because we've seen not in the last episode issue, but the issue prior, we saw something that looked pretty similar to the bridge, but not 100% accurate.
Yeah, but the interesting thing here is, like I said, maybe the layout is different, but we have Spock in what looks like the helmsman position.
You know, in an issue of the comic that I think features far more of the standard complement than prior comics before this, it's weird to see Spock in that position.
Yeah, especially when they reference Sulu a couple of panels later.
And Uhura.
Yeah, who should be behind Kirk.
Yeah, so Uhura is named and appears in this comic and is part of the away team with Sulu, Spock, McCoy, and Kirk, while Scotty stays on the ship. So very, very interesting that Uhura and Sulu, who have been pretty much either non-existent or ancillary characters in prior comics, are front and center in this one. Yeah. So, you know, one thing that I thought was really cool about this issue, and maybe this is the author starting to get a little more familiar with the TV series, but they established the fact that we know that the Enterprise is supposed to explore strange new worlds, and they're supposed to be out there finding new places people haven't been. And we know on the show, they always seem to go places people have already been. And in the comic, they are kind of going places that people necessarily haven't been. But this one establishes the fact that they have robot probes, who are out there looking around in places that people haven't been already and cataloging places that may be of interest. So we've got a robotic probe that has found this planet that has something that may be of interest to Starfleet or to humanity, and the Enterprise follows up on those findings. I thought that was a really cool premise to set, and I wish that was something that had happened on the show proper. And it would kind of go a little bit further in explaining how they chose where they were going. It always seemed like in the show they were in a kind of a haphazard way of traveling around. And most of the time it seemed like they'd been where places where people had already been, or they were responding to distress calls or whatnot. But if they had set it up in such a way that there were robotic probes that had been sent out prior that had found places of interest that the Enterprise had subsequently been assigned to go to, that may have been a more interesting way to set up the episodes.
Oh, totally. Yeah, I agree with you there.
So again, we have an uninhabited planet that turns out to be and actually inhabited. But I like the fact that Kirk doesn't find it strange at all that the planet was initially thought to be uninhabited, but turns out to be inhabited. It's like almost like he's learned from prior comic issues that, you know, whenever somebody says that the planet appears to be uninhabited, that it turns out to actually have people on it.
Yeah, it almost seems like that's like the default setting. That's the expectation. That's their normal.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And, you know, it's funny. I think in this issue, all of the standard complement of Enterprise regulars are there with the exception of Chekhov.
Yes.
So finally, we're seeing full participation of all of the first season TOS characters.
Yeah, I would argue though that Scotty is Scotty in voice and name only.
Yeah, once again, he is blonde haired yet again, and the Scottish accent is a little bit half-assed. Yeah, it just seems like Scotty is not really totally 100% Scotty that we know from the show. It's almost as if he's the engineer, he's operating the transporter, but it's like they kind of slap a Scottish accent on him, and he's not the heroic engineer that we know.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. One thing, though, that I think is really cool about this issue is that we've got, once again, the McCoy Spock back and forth ribbing that we got from the show.
Yeah, and I actually think one interaction is actually probably straight from the show where McCoy says something to the effect of you can be irritatingly human, and then Spock says this is no time for insults. That seems like something that was almost lifted from an exchange on the show.
That could have almost been a verbatim copy of dialogue from the show. So I love the fact that this comic seems to be even closer, almost to the show itself as far as characters are concerned.
Mm-hmm.
So that's great that the writer is finally kind of clued in to what was going on the TV show, even though this is almost 2 years after the show went off the air.
Yeah.
And he's finally gotten to the point where he's kind of in tune with the show itself. So, that kind of supports our theory that he'd written the first handful of issues, based on nothing more than, some press releases and some press shots of the original crew. And now maybe he's finally caught up to the fact that the show had been on the air and he'd watched some of them and incorporated what he saw into his writing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the tricorder is name dropped, but hyphenated. So tri-quarter in this issue. So it's nice to see some more terminology starting to converge. One thing I thought that was a little bit interesting about this is that, thinking back on the Savage Curtain, when Abraham Lincoln appeared floating in space in front of the Enterprise, Abraham Lincoln himself knew who Captain Kirk was and the Enterprise crew was when he came on board the ship. He was already familiar with them. But George Washington down on the planet has no clue who Kirk and the crew of the landing party are. So it's a little bit of a different approach of introducing a historic figure from Earth's history.
Yeah, and he also doesn't understand why they know who he is. So is this a George Washington who wasn't president, or doesn't think being president is worth being remembered for?
Or doesn't speak Esperanto?
Oh.
No, that's a good point, though. This is we come to find out that these are actually androids who have taken the shape of historic figures based on this historic data that has been harnessed by this Lazarus character. But, it is interesting that they don't seem to be very self-aware of who they are or their historical significance. So one thing I really thought was great was that Kirk can't seem to help himself in this comic. And the one thing that is forbidden, or the one thing that's the mysterious element in the comic, which is the silver spire that's in the middle of the city that they've beamed into is off limits. He just can't help himself but sending people to investigate it, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's really, for me, the only reason they stick around on this planet, because what would they have done if the Silver Spire mission wasn't there?
That's a good point. So but thinking about it, that, you know, you've got George Washington and Helen of Troy so far, but there are other historical figures that pop up. Now, wouldn't you think that they would have pretty much a field day just sitting down and interviewing all of these historic Earth figures that pop up on this planet? Because, you know, we've got literature that catalogs who these people are and what they did, but we don't have any interviews or personal accounts of their lives. Now, they could really benefit from sitting down and talking to all of these people firsthand, and they pretty much have unlimited amount of time to do that. So if this is in fact some sort of mythological haven where these people actually exist, they could really take a month or two to sit down and talk to every single one of them and catalog their entire lives, right?
Yeah, you know, actually, that could be their new 5-year mission.
There you go. 5 years worth of sitting down and talking to every historic figure. All right, so, you know, let's move on with the storyline here. We've gotten a little involved in the first part. So Kirk has sent off a couple of his crew members to investigate the Spire, while Washington introduces them to the crew, and Nero, the Emperor of Rome, and the supposed 45th President of the United States, Anton York. Abraham Lincoln surfaces yet again for his second appearance in the original series and comic books. And some of the other people show up are Alexander the Great, Napoleon, Cleopatra, Louis XIV, Florence Nightingale, and a few others. So McCoy, after seeing all of these people, comes to the conclusion that they must have somehow found heaven. So they thought they found Eden prior to this in The Way to Eden, which didn't turn out to be Eden. Maybe this is actually Eden, but doesn't unfortunately turn out that way. And Kirk sees out of the corner of his eye what appears to be Adolf Hitler and another member of the Nazi party, which in Kirk's mind means that this is definitely not heaven, and winds up correcting McCoy. Kirk tries to contact Spock to see what the progress is on checking out the Spire, but doesn't get an answer. They wind up heading across town and find Sulu with a large lump on his head as if he'd been been attacked, and Spock is nowhere to be found. So cut to another scene. Spock awakes and finds himself underground and tied to a chair. A man who happens to be in the room with him introduces himself as Alexander Lazarus, and an Earth historian who has befallen a similar fate to another character in a prior comic. He's exiled himself from Earth after his experiments with computer science and androids have made him not exactly a favorable person on the planet, and he escapes to continue his studies elsewhere. And he eventually found himself on this barren planet and began creating his androids once again. So the Silver Spire, as it turns out, is some sort of an antenna attached to his computer, which is somehow capable of recording brainwaves or thoughts from important and famous people throughout Earth's history. One day, as he was doing some recording and experimenting with his androids, one of them short-circuited and wound up getting caught in a discharge of energy from this computer system and was transformed somehow into Benjamin Franklin. I guess once he saw Benjamin Franklin, he assumed that he could start to reproduce other famous people from Earth's history and began to do so. Within a few months, the androids that he had built created a city that was based around this spire, and Lazarus began to imbue them with the minds and memories of further people from Earth's history. And now, after having done this for quite a amount of time, Lazarus has found himself bored and wants to embark on a new historic journey of discovery. And now that the Vulcan Spock has found his way to this planet, Lazarus has surmised that he can take Spock's brain and attempt to delve into Vulcan history. So once again, Spock's brain becomes the focus of interest in another Star Trek episode.
So at what point does Anton York enter the race for the upcoming election?
Good question, Craig. And this is interesting because aren't we in the cusp of picking the 45th president?
Yes.
Of the United States right now as we record this. So Barack Obama is the 44th president. I don't see a candidate named Anton York so far in the Democratic or Republican parties.
So this is also another possible split point between the series and the TV series and the comic series in determining when the Star Trek timeline deviates from our actual timeline. Because it seems like the original series deviates, we figured maybe sometime around the 1990s.
You have to think that anything that happened between when the series was written in the late 60s and the prediction of the 90s was kind of in a state of flux, right?
Yeah.
So the historical figures that were referenced on the original series all existed before 1967, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess Anton York was complete speculation.
Yeah, and he's kind of dressed like I also like the fact that next year we'll be dressing like Doctor Strange.
Yeah, we're gonna go back to that sort of.
Hey, I can't wait to start wearing a cape.
I'm keeping my fingers crossed that this comes to pass. But I thought it was really cool that Abraham Lincoln showed up again after we saw him in the Savage Curtain and he died.
Yeah.
I thought it was really cool that they brought him back. So that just goes to show you that anybody has the potential to come back in Star Trek no matter what happens to them.
Yep.
Another interesting point about this issue is that the Alexander Lazarus character embodies some of the same traits we've seen in other characters in prior Gold Key comics. So he's another one of these potentially disgraced people from Earth who had some virtuous things that they've done on Earth, but were somehow discredited by one single mishap or a group of mishaps, and therefore either exiled or chose a self-exile from Earth and wound up on another planet. So Lazarus was in the field of android creation, much as Dr. Soong, and wound up, I guess, one thing malfunctioned for him, and that discredited his entire line of work, and he wound up having to somehow leave Earth. I guess anybody who on Earth is discredited in the Gold Key comics has access to some sort of a spaceship that they can leave with.
Yes.
Capable of long-distance space travel, and they can just pick where they land and start over again.
Oh, yeah.
So Lazarus is now burrowed underneath this planet and created this android factory that he's been using to create historic figures. And now he's got a computer. This really kind of made me wonder and scratch my head as to where they come up with this idea. He's got a computer attached to this silver spire that is capable of reading the thought patterns of people from Earth.
This was the major disconnect of the issue for me.
Now, and the thing that really stuck out to me is that the computer is somehow able to read the thoughts of dead people.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't get it.
So, I mean, by the time this was happening, it had been many, many hundreds of years since George Washington had died, and much, much longer than that since Helen of Troy had died.
Yeah,
so,
I thought I missed something.
Yeah, maybe we did, but is this comic trying to tell us that our brainwaves are out there in space somewhere? Our brainwaves, like television and radio signals, are floating around out in space for aliens to pick up?
Yeah, but wouldn't that make us all immortal?
I love that thought. That someday once I croak, somebody can pick up my brainwaves and completely reproduce me into a living being again. That's a great thought.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Craig. You may have just made my fear of death completely invalid.
Ah.
So, and I love the Spock's brain tie-in.
Yes, I have to assume that was a wink, a nod, or a little wink by the writer.
I thought that maybe that was a wink from the writer, but the fact that they don't include Chekhov in this, I'm wondering if the writer had only seen the first season.
Oh, wow. That would be an incredible coincidence.
Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. All right, so moving along, we've got another captain's log. This is the second captain's log with no floating book, as it were. So, captain's log, stardate 1026.8. Upon beaming down to the planet Gamma Alpha 5, we discovered something incredible. A city populated by every famous person who ever walked the Earth. While examining a strange silver tower in the city center, Mr. Spock disappeared. Even now, my first officer, my friend, is somewhere on this planet, perhaps in terrible danger. This actually, to me, sounds like a captain's log that would have happened on the show.
Yeah, I like the use of the word friend. I thought it really connected the relationships in the comic to the relationship on the show.
I feel like this comic is closer to the show than any comic we've read prior to this. You know, I love the fact that they're really fleshing out the fact that Kirk and Spock have a very close relationship, and they're implying that Kirk is worried about Spock's well-being. So, moving on, Spock is once again in a cavern underneath the planet. He is confronting Lazarus about the fact that he doesn't understand how his brain would be any use to Lazarus. And Lazarus goes on to explain that while his clones can't understand Vulcan thoughts, he can, in fact, teach the computer to utilize Spock's brain to extract Spock's knowledge of Vulcan history and therefore extrapolate the identities of historic figures from Vulcan, where he can recreate them and learn from them. Mm-hmm. So just as Spock start to maybe attempt to reason with Lazarus, some sort of an alarm on a nearby computer goes off and alerts Lazarus to the fact that Sulu and Kirk have found a way to get down to the area in which they are currently residing. And that makes Lazarus kind of go into a bit of a panic and decide that he's going to just dispatch with Spock right there using some sort of a phaser gun. And, Lazarus is a little bit concerned with his own well-being as well and presses some sort of a button on a computer that makes his androids on the planet surface start to attack the landing party. So once again, the previously thought uninhabited planet winds up being hostile, and the landing party winds up getting attacked by the inhabitants on the planet. So this is a recurring theme in these Gold Key comics so far. So
yeah,
I thought it was a little bit strange that they introduced this floating book concept for Captain's Logs in prior issues and abandoned it in this one.
Yeah, I don't know. This looks like the same artist?
It is. It is the same artist. And maybe it was just a choice that they had made to draw that book out in prior issues, and maybe they thought the better of it for this one?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Did you detect the fact that Lazarus seems to suffer from the typical villain's syndrome, and instead of just doing with Spock what he wants to do, he decides to monologue for several pages about what he's doing and why he's doing it?
Yeah, totally. He definitely falls into that stereotype.
One thing I thought was really cool about this comic is that, we've seen in prior comics and in the series, the original series itself, tons of male characters fighting aliens and different people. But in this issue, we see Uhura taking a swing at one of the androids.
Yeah.
I love the fact that Uhura is actually doing some of the fighting.
Yeah. Badass.
One other thing that kind of stuck out to me was that the phasers, Kirk orders phasers to be set on heavy stun. I don't think we've ever heard of phasers being set on heavy stun. And would phasers on stun affect androids?
Yeah, you'd think not.
You would think stun would affect humanoids, but would robots be affected by a phaser on stun?
No, you'd think there'd have to be a separate robot setting.
But yeah, that's a good question. So if anybody out there in listener land has any thoughts on whether or not phasers would affect androids, let us know. And I don't think we've seen on the show prior to this anybody shooting a robot with a phaser on stun. All right, so moving along, back down in the chamber, Spock has somehow miraculously off camera freed himself from his bonds and is now attempting to disarm Lazarus. And he uses a kind of a Karate Kid kick move and and kicks the phaser out of Lazarus's hand. And after a short confrontation, Lazarus flees from Spock and somehow stumbles into a chamber that he built himself, supposedly, that will drain the thought patterns from his brain. Spock attempts to free him from this chamber, but discovers that it's completely sealed and he has no way to free him, so Lazarus is pretty much done for. The device drains Lazarus's brain, killing him, and Spock at the same time notices that the phaser blasts that Lazarus attempted to kill him with have also set the computer systems in the room on fire, and they are in the process of burning down. So Spock decides that he needs to save whatever records Lazarus has created from all of these historical figures from Earth's history, and he contacts Scotty aboard the Enterprise using his communicator and insists that Scotty beam up the rest of the landing party from the planet's surface while leaving Spock there on the planet underneath the ground to extract this information from Lazarus's computers.
Yeah, I don't understand why separate beaming is such a problem for them. Because at the end of the issue, they clearly define that they can do it. So I don't understand why Kirk is so insistent on waiting until they know where Spock is to beam up. You'd think they would beam out of harm's way. They could even beam down to another part of the planet and go do what they need to do. And I also kind of have a little bit of an issue with Spock being so insistent on staying behind. I understand the value in what's down there, but isn't the historical record really enough? It's not like they'd be losing something that hasn't at least been preserved historically. And, going further, I understand that, dead people don't really have privacy rights once they die. But it almost seems like having the kind of access to these people's, basically the essence of these people, I don't know, it seems a little invasive to me.
No, definitely, I agree. And something that occurred to me as well is that would these androids' contributions to historical record be admissible?
Yeah, exactly.
We assume that Lazarus's computer works, but he claims to be able to harness the memories and personalities of historical figures remotely using this spire from who knows. We don't know how far this computer is away from Earth or how it actually accesses and receives the brainwaves of these historical figures. So would Starfleet or humanity as a whole accept the information that's captured from these radio waves that this computer is harnessing?
Yeah, that's why I don't. Spock of all people shouldn't be that caught up on staying behind to preserve this stuff, and at least in my opinion.
Well, I agree.
It wouldn't seem logical.
No, it doesn't seem logical at all, and I don't see how Spock could jump to the conclusion that all of this information that he's going to save by risking his life is in any way accurate.
Yeah.
So I love the fact that Spock does a Karate Kid-esque crane kick to kick the phaser out of Lazarus's hand.
Yeah, I think a lot of the action, beats in this issue were really well illustrated.
Yeah, they definitely were, especially Lazarus's attack on Spock with the rolling file cabinet.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was an interesting choice. That Lazarus, having escaped from Earth, somehow had a rolling two-drawer file cabinet with him.
Yeah.
Either he brought it with him from Earth or had to make it there on this planet was pretty amusing. And one thing that really stuck out to me as weird is that, up until this point, we had a thought that Lazarus was creating androids who were caught in some sort of energy beam and imbued with the memories, right, of remote dead people from Earth. But now we understand that Lazarus also built some sort of a chamber that's capable of harnessing the brain waves or brain from a person that you put into that chamber.
Yeah. I don't know.
Why would he build that? Why would he build that? And why would it be inescapable?
Yeah.
If his whole computer system was rigged up to accept brainwaves from, disembodied people that happen to be floating around in space, what would he need with a chamber specifically designed to harness brainwaves from an actual living being?
Mm-hmm.
But also kind of ironic because he winds up getting caught in it and it being his own undoing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So once again, since Spock calls up to the Enterprise and talks to Scotty, we see Scotty once again displayed with blonde hair and weird attempts at a Scottish accent. Scotty is featured very prominently as the transporter operator, not as the heroic engineer, but as basically the transporter operator, and doesn't look like Scotty from the show.
Yeah, he ordered us to beam ye up.
Yeah.
Face palm.
Big time face palm. So moving on, we're getting close to the end of the story here. Scotty beams up all of the landing party members, leaving Spock underground in Lazarus's chamber. Winds up saving Kirk, McCoy, Sulu, and Uhura from an unwinnable battle against the androids. They were severely outnumbered. But Scotty goes on to tell Kirk that Spock is still trapped underneath the surface of the planet, and the transporter in its normal capacity is unable to beam Spock out. Mm-hmm. So Kirk insists that Scotty amp up the transporter power levels to be able to penetrate the planet's surface and beam Spock out. Scotty notes the fact that it would take at least double the normal transporter power to increase to that type of a level where it could get Spock out, and it wouldn't last that long. The transporter has a risk of burning out at that level of power output. So he attempts to beam Spock out, but before that happens, there are some large explosions, and we find that the cavern itself that Spock was in has been completely destroyed by the damage that Lazarus has done with his phaser fire, and I guess we're meant to understand that Spock is now dead in the comics. But only one panel later do we discover that Spock is actually alive, and the transporter was able to lock on and pull him out. Unfortunately, he was not able to save any of the records that he had set out to save by staying in that dangerous scenario. Nope. So the Enterprise races away from the planet at warp speed because Spock told them that the planet was going to blow up and they needed to get as far away as possible. They survived the concussive explosion and shock waves, and we rejoin the crew later on after they're safely away, where Spock and McCoy are having one of their familiar episode-ending verbal exchanges, some like comedic exchange where McCoy is making some statements and Spock is making him out to be a kind of a silly human, and Kirk comes in at the end and makes some philosophical statements that make us all think about our own place in the world and the inspiration for life. So Craig, do you have any thoughts on the end of this issue?
No, I mean it hits some good beats. I like the overall push to the end of the episode, even though it seems kind of unnecessary, and a roundabout way to get where they got. But I do like the trifecta of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy at the end having what really feels like an encounter that would occur at the end of an episode. I think you kind of alluded to it or flat out stated it earlier in this discussion that this could almost be like a bridge issue between the TV show and the comic series. At least I think it's the closest we've come.
Oh, absolutely. They hit so many points in this comic that are very close to what the show was that we're starting to blur the lines a bit between what we've seen on the show and the characters that we see in these Gold Key comics. And, if you compare issue number 9 to issue maybe 1 and 2 and 3, there are very, very stark differences in the way the characters conduct themselves and the way the dialogue is written. Yep. That it really stands out to me and you as well, I guess, that we're starting to get to the point where the show is having more of an influence on what we're seeing in the comic.
Yep.
Yeah. So page 23 of the comic I thought was particularly interesting because there's a frame there near the bottom of the page that depicts Uhura getting beaten up by George Washington.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. That seems like a really weird choice in illustrations to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know what the reasoning behind that was, but probably not the best choice.
Yeah.
Interesting that they established the fact that they can amplify the power of the transporter beam to reach people in difficult areas. I like the fact that they described the fact that the transporter is adjustable. Up to this point, I'm not sure even on the show if we were aware that the transporter beam could be amplified to grab people who may have been particularly obscured or either inside a building or underground. So interesting exposition on the technology there. I love the fact that they mentioned warp speed in this issue.
Yeah.
I don't think that we've heard warp speed mentioned prior to this.
No. Although it seems like Warp 8 seems a little bit... Doesn't that seem a little bit advanced for the original series?
Yes. So they start off at Warp 5, which is perfectly acceptable in the original series universe, but then they have to kick it up to Warp Factor 8 to escape the concussion explosion of the planet. So that does seem a little bit high. I don't think... I'm racking my brain at this point, but I believe that Warp 8 was beyond the capabilities of the original Enterprise, except in certain circumstances where it had been modified by aliens.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think Warp 8 might have been too fast.
Yeah,
for them. I like the fact that Spock is miraculously saved from death, but it's only literally a one panel difference between Spock being dead and Spock being saved.
Yeah, it's cheap.
Yeah, it almost seems like one of those things where if this was an episode of the TV show, we'd have at least a couple of minutes where Spock's existence was in question. But due to the fact that the comics had to be so short, that they had so much content to draw and publish that they didn't have any spare frames to let the audience wonder whether or not Spock was actually alive.
Yeah.
But I do like the fact that the comic book ends with a Kirk, Spock, and McCoy Trinity moment.
Yep.
I like that it's an indication to me that the comic is finally going to start getting on track and being a true extension to the TV show.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's and that wasn't something that was always there on the show. It was something that became more commonplace as the series moved on.
Yeah.
So very, very glad to see that that's made its way into the comic series. So, any final thoughts to wrap up issue number 9 of Gold Key Comics?
No. I guess I would just jump in and say that I think I think I'd have to vote this an essential entry for the Gold Key Comics.
Oh, yeah, good call. I was going to do the same thing for a couple of different reasons. One, this is the first mention of warp speed in the comic book. I love the fact that they're taking more cues from the television show. And this is the first comic book where the entire first season TOS crew is actually represented in the comic. So fantastic that we're moving forward in Gold Key, and I'm anxious to get on to episode number 10 or issue number 10 next week with you. And I guess we're gonna sign off for another episode of the Tricorder Transmissions. So feel free to catch up with us on Facebook at facebook.com/the Tricorder Transmissions, on Twitter at TTT_pod, and our personal Twitters. Mine is J_Benj. That's J_BENJ. And Craig, yours is at Mr. Craig Cohen, MR Craig Cohen.
Yep.
All right. So hopefully we'll talk to some of you on social media. Thanks, of course, for tuning in to this episode of the Tricorder Transmissions, and we'll see you next Sunday.